History is rarely a series of accidents. It is a calculated sequence of whispers, secret handshakes, and signatures made in the dark. In our last chapter, we saw Sultan Abdul Hamid II stand as the final unyielding wall against the tides of global finance. He refused the gold, he rejected the offer, and he chose the survival of a principle over the survival of his own crown. But the Shadow Master knew that walls eventually crumble when the foundation is undermined by betrayal. Welcome to Uncomfortable History. The year is 1917. The world is engulfed in the flames of the Great War. The Ottoman Empire, once the Lion of the East, is bleeding out, gasping its final breaths under the weight of European steel. The Sultan's prophecy was coming true. The vultures had arrived, and they weren't just looking for territory. They were looking to settle a debt that had been pending since 1901. While millions of young men were dying in the mud of the trenches, a different kind of war was being won in the silent, wood-paneled offices of London. On November 2nd, 1917, a letter was written. It wasn't a book or a treaty. It was a mere 67 words. A short note from the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to a leader of the Zionist community, Lord Walter Rothschild. 67 words. That is all it took to sign the death warrant of a nation. But to understand the true gravity of this document, you must understand the map of lies that Britain was drawing. At the very same moment, Balfour was promising Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people. British agents like T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, were promising the exact same land to the Arabs in exchange for their revolt against the Ottomans. Britain was selling a house it didn't own to two different buyers at the same time. This was the ultimate colonial shell game. It was a cold-blooded calculation where the currency was human blood and the prize was the heart of the Middle East. The British Empire wasn't just redrawing maps. They were lighting a slow-burning fuse that would take a century to explode. Today, as we watch the fire and smoke rise over Jerusalem and Gaza, we are told this is a modern conflict, a religious war, a struggle of our time. But the truth is much more uncomfortable. Every explosion we see today is an echo of those 67 words written in 1917. The Sultan warned his advisors that if the door to Palestine was opened with a golden key, it would never be closed without an ocean of blood. Today, we open the vault. We look at the letters, the lies, and the signatures of the men who decided the fate of millions without ever stepping foot on the soil they were giving away. This is the moment the prophecy became a tragedy. Stay uncomfortable. To understand why a British politician would hand over a piece of the Middle East to a private citizen, we must first look at the state of the world in 1916. The Great War was no longer a glorious march to victory. It had become a meat grinder. From the muddy trenches of the Somme to the frozen plains of Russia, millions of men were being turned into dust. Britain was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the German U-boats were strangling their supply lines. The British Empire, the greatest power on earth, was desperate. And desperate empires do not make moral choices. They make survival choices. While the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, was being torn apart from within, the British were playing a triple game of deception. They weren't just redrawing a map. They were selling the same piece of land 3 different times to 3 different people. Before the world ever heard of the Balfour Declaration, the British had already made a deal with the Arabs. through a series of secret letters known as the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. The British promised Sharif Hussein of Mecca a massive, independent Arab kingdom that included Palestine. All the Arabs had to do was rise up and stab the Ottomans in the back. Led by the legendary and enigmatic T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, the Arab tribes bled and died for British interests, believing that their reward was freedom. They didn't know that while they were fighting in the burning sands of the Hejaz, British diplomats in London were already sharpening the knives to carve up their promised kingdom. While the Arabs were fighting for a dream of independence, two men, Mark Sykes for Britain and François-Georges Picot for France, sat in a quiet room with a map and a ruler. In 1916, they signed the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement. They didn't care about the people living there. They didn't care about the Sultan's warnings. They simply drew a line in the sand from the E in Acre to the K in Kirkuk. The north was for France, the south was for Britain. Palestine was meant to be an international zone, but the British didn't want to share. They wanted a buffer zone to protect their most precious asset, the Suez Canal, the jugular vein of the British Empire. To take Palestine for themselves, they needed a new moral justification. They needed a partner. By 1917, the Zionists were no longer a fringe group of dreamers. They were a well-organized political force led by Chaim Weizmann, a brilliant chemist who had helped the British war effort, and Lord Walter Rothschild, a man whose name was synonymous with global finance. The British government, led by Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour, saw an opportunity. They believed in a dangerous myth, that the world's Jewish community held the keys to the Russian and American war machines. They believed that by promising Palestine to the Zionists, they could convince the newly revolutionary Russia to stay in the war and, more importantly, pull the United States and its massive industrial power into the conflict. It was a cold, transactional deal. The British didn't love the Zionist cause. They used it. They needed the influence of the Rothschilds and the financial power they represented to turn the tide of a losing war. The document itself went through 5 different drafts. It wasn't written in a rush. Every word was weighed for its potential to deceive. On November 2nd, 1917, Arthur Balfour sent the final letter to Lord Rothschild. It was a masterpiece of political ambiguity. It said the British government viewed with favor the establishment of a national home. Not a state, not a country, but a home. It promised that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. This was the ultimate insult. The existing non-Jewish communities, the Arabs, made up 90% of the population at the time. The British referred to the rightful owners of the land as an existing community, as if they were guests in their own house. They promised rights to the Arabs while giving the house away to someone else. Somewhere, in the silence of his exile, Sultan Abdul Hamid II must have felt the tremors of this betrayal. He had told Herzl that the land was won with blood and would only be taken with blood. The British thought they could avoid this. They thought they could manage the chaos they were creating. But they had ignored the human element. They had ignored the fact that you cannot promise the same home to 2 different families and expect peace. The Balfour Declaration wasn't just a letter. It was the blueprint for a century of apartheid, displacement, and war. It was the moment the British Empire decided that the stability of the Middle East was a fair price to pay for its own survival. As the news of the declaration reached the streets of Jerusalem, the air changed. The era of the Ottomans was over, and the era of the Mandate, of checkpoints, of riots, and of the Great Catastrophe was about to begin. The fuse had been lit. The explosion was coming. Stay uncomfortable. The year 1918 brought a deceptive silence to the world. The guns of the Great War had fallen silent, and the war to end all wars was over. But in the dusty streets of Jerusalem and the ancient hills of Galilee, a different kind of darkness was beginning to settle. The Ottoman flags, the flags the Sultan had vowed to protect with his life, had been lowered for the last time. In their place rose the Union Jack, the flag of an empire that had built its victory on a mountain of conflicting promises. This was no longer a matter of secret letters and wood-paneled offices. This was the moment the ink of the Balfour Declaration met the soil of Palestine. This was the beginning of the end. For years, the Arabs had fought alongside the British, led by the promise of an independent kingdom. They believed they were the allies of the victors. But in late 1917, the world was rocked by a scandal that exposed the British Empire as the ultimate architect of lies. After the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks broke into the secret archives of the Tsar and found the hidden Sykes-Picot Agreement. They published it to the world. Imagine the shock of Sharif Hussein and the Arab fighters when they realized that while they were shedding blood for Britain and France had already carved up their land like a piece of stolen meat. They realized that the Balfour Declaration wasn't just a separate promise. It was the final nail in the coffin of Arab sovereignty. The realization hit like a thunderbolt. They hadn't been fought for. They had been used. By 1920, the British didn't just walk into Palestine. They legalized their occupation through a new invention called the Mandate System. Under the guise of a sacred trust of civilization, the League of Nations handed Palestine to Britain. But this wasn't a mission of help. It was a mission of replacement. The British mandate for Palestine didn't just include the Balfour Declaration. It was built around it. The British were now legally bound to facilitate Jewish immigration and land purchases. They were the muscle, the wall, and the protectors of a project that the native population, the 90% Arab majority, viewed as a foreign invasion. The British Mandate officials, many of whom were secret Zionists themselves, began the process of dismantling the old Ottoman land laws. They made it easier for the Zionist commissions to buy vast tracts of land, often from absentee landlords in Beirut or Damascus. Thousands of Arab tenant farmers, who had tilled that soil for generations under the Sultan's protection, were suddenly evicted. They weren't just losing a war. They were losing their homes, their history, and their future. The Sultan had warned that this path would lead to an ocean of blood. In 1920 and 1921, the first waves of that ocean reached the shore. The Nabi Musa riots and the Jaffa uprisings were the first signs that the peace Britain promised was a hallucination. The Arabs weren't fighting because of religion. They were fighting because they were being erased. They watched as the British allowed thousands of immigrants to arrive, while simultaneously crushing any Arab attempt at self-government. Every time the Arabs protested, the British responded with the same cold, colonial iron fist they used in India and Africa. By 1929, the tension reached a breaking point at the Wailing Wall, Al-Burak. What started as a dispute over a holy site exploded into a nationwide revolt. Over 200 people were killed in a week. The British realized they had created a monster they could no longer control. They had promised a home to one people on top of the home of another, and the friction was generating a heat that would eventually burn the entire Middle East. Between 1936 and 1939, the Palestinians launched the Great Arab Revolt. This was a full-scale peasant war against the British Empire. They blocked roads, cut telegraph lines, and fought the British army to a standstill. The British responded with collective punishment, burning entire villages, executing rebels without trial, and using the same tactics the world would later condemn in other dictatorships. But the British were tired. Another world war was looming in Europe. The gold that the Zionists had promised in 1917 was no longer enough to pay for the mounting cost of the blood being shed in the streets of Haifa and Gaza. In a moment of supreme cowardice, the British issued the White Paper of 1939, trying to limit the very immigration they had started. They had betrayed the Arabs in 1917, and now they were betraying the Zionists in 1939. They had lied to everyone, and in doing so, they had ensured that there could never be a peaceful solution. By 1947, the British Empire was a shadow of its former self. They surrendered their mandate to the United Nations and walked away, leaving behind a land primed for an explosion. On May 14, 1948, as the last British soldier left Haifa, the first Arab-Israeli War began. The national home had become a state, and the national home of the Arabs had become a graveyard of dreams known as the Nakba. Sultan Abdul Hamid II had sat in the flickering candlelight of the Yildiz Palace and told Theodor Herzl that Palestine could not be bought. He had warned that once the door was opened with gold, it would be closed with iron and blood. Today, as we look at the ruins of Gaza, the concrete walls of the West Bank, and the grieving mothers on both sides, we are looking at the final tragic fulfillment of that prophecy. We are living in the world that Arthur Balfour's 67 words created. We are living in the echo of a betrayal that is now over a century old. The British thought they could manage the chaos. They thought they were the masters of the game. But they were just the architects of a disaster that they eventually ran away from. They left the fire burning, and today, the world is still trying to put it out. The Sultan lost his throne. The Arabs lost their land. The world lost its peace. And the 67 words of the Balfour Declaration remain etched in history as the most expensive lie ever told. Stay uncomfortable. The British Empire is gone. The maps they drew in secret are now stained so deeply with blood that the lines have become permanent scars on the face of the earth. Arthur Balfour, Lord Rothschild, and Mark Sykes are all dead, buried in the soil of a country that was never torn apart by the decisions they made. They never had to hear the sirens. They never had to dig their children out of the rubble. But their 67 words? Those words are still alive. They are the shrapnel in every explosion. They are the wire in every checkpoint. They are the ghost that haunts every peace treaty that was never meant to succeed. We must return one last time to the Yildiz Palace, to the man who saw it all coming. Sultan Abdul Hamid II wasn't just a ruler. He was a witness to the birth of a monster. When he looked at the gold of the Zionists, he didn't see wealth. He saw the 100-Year War. He knew that once you treat a sacred land like a piece of real estate, you don't just sell the soil, you sell the peace of future generations. Today, we are told that the conflict in the Middle East is complicated. We are told it is an ancient religious struggle that no one can solve. But there is nothing complicated about a lie. There's nothing ancient about a 1917 letter. The tragedy of Palestine is not a mystery. It is a calculation. It was the price the British Empire was willing to pay to keep its own heart beating for a few more years. The question history cannot answer. As we look at the flickering images on our screens in 2026, the ruins of Gaza, the tears of mothers, the unbroken cycle of violence, we have to ask ourselves the most uncomfortable question of all. Who is truly responsible? Is it the Sultan, whose refusal to compromise accelerated his own downfall? Or is it the empire that traded a land it didn't own for a victory it couldn't sustain? Or perhaps, is it the silence of the world that allowed a 67-word letter to become a century-long death warrant? History is a graveyard of secrets, and most people are content to walk over the graves without ever looking down. But you are here. You have listened to the truth that the textbooks try to sanitize. If this story has shaken you, if you feel the weight of this betrayal, then you are part of the uncomfortable history community. Tell me in the comments, if you were the Sultan in 1901, would you have taken the gold to save your empire? Or would you have chosen the path he took, knowing it would lead to your destruction? Share this video, because the loudest weapon against a century of lies is a single voice speaking the truth. Subscribe. We are going deeper into the archives. The shadows are getting darker, and the truths are getting harder to hear. The ink on the Balfour Declaration dried over a century ago. But in the heart of the Middle East, that ink is still wet, and it's not ink anymore. It is the blood of the innocent. It is the dust of the displaced. The Sultan's throne is gone. The British Empire is a memory. But the fire they lit in 1917 is still burning. And as long as we refuse to look at the spark that started it, we will never be able to put out the flame. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past. It is an inheritance of ash. I am uncomfortable history. The truth is bitter. The shadows are watching. Stay uncomfortable.